Constanze Stelzenmüller, please offer the German perspectives.
All right. First off, thank you very much for having me here. This is my first Leangkollen conference, and I'm most impressed not just by the hospitality of the food, which is spectacular, but also by the quality of the presentations and the organization. So thank you. Let me begin by offering you something that I think you don't often get from a German, when you have Germans talking about transatlantic security and their position in it, which is foundational principles. I think for decades, our allies and neighbors have been used to hearing us talking reactively about situations, about EU and alliance security frameworks. And I think one sometimes loses sight of the fact that there are actually some very strong foundational principles driving our commitment to our security alliances. And I think those are worth recalling. And it won't surprise you when I say that that starts with history. Our history between 1933 and 1945 still informs fundamentally our commitment to values, to multilateralism, and to international law, and that is, as far as I'm concerned, as it should be, and as it should always be. But there is another part of history which people, I think, take a little less note of, and that is 1989. 1989 added an additional element, which is the commitment to the agency of civil society and self-determination. What that translates into is, if we as Germans benefited from Germany's first successful democratic revolution and the first successful and non-violent democratic revolution, because the East Germans marched in the streets after the Poles and the Hungarians marched and other people marched, then who are we to deny the Ukrainians agency and self-determination? And in fact, don't we have a moral obligation to support it and other similar movements? I'm not sure that that feeling and its roots in 1989 are sufficiently appreciated outside of Germany. It's for me, a really important point. The other aspect of our history which plays a role these days is the fact that we have always considered that our domestic order is fundamentally important for the credibility and the legitimacy of our foreign and security policy. The difference between the past decades and now is that that always seemed like a banal thing today, because we took our democratic and constitutional orders, political pluralism, protection of minorities, functioning markets, and a functioning social contract in an open society for granted, and we took it for granted that those same principles operated elsewhere across the West. But the reality is we cannot take them for granted any longer, but they are foundational, and we now find ourselves suddenly in a position where they are being questioned by external actors, in particular Russia, and by where they're being questioned by authoritarian and populist movements in our own system, including in our own country. But there is, of course, a linkage. There can be no credible and legitimate foreign and security policy without a credible and legitimate domestic order. The second foundational principle for Germans is, or foundational point, let me put it that way, is geopolitics. This is something that, for all the obvious reason, went a little bit out of fashion in Germany for a couple of decades. You didn't get a lot of Germans talking about geopolitics. But the reality is that this too is essential to how we think about our position in NATO and in the EU. We're at the center, literally, at the heart of the European continent, and we share borders with 9 countries, most of whom are a lot smaller and less powerful than we are. The power differentials within Europe are considerable, and they've grown larger, particularly between Germany and some of its smaller and more vulnerable neighbors. And with the resurgence of a territorial-based threat in Europe, it's not just territorial-based threat, but it is that too, that suddenly has made geopolitics more important again. It's brought it again to the forefront of German security thinking. What our position and our open and multiple borders have always meant is that there is no other way for Germany to live than with openness and with integration. the notion of Germany delinking itself from Europe or pulling up the drawbridges and re-erecting borders is simply, for us, nonsensical. It's impossible. We live from trade and engagement and commerce of all kinds with our neighbors. And if that stopped, it would change our way of living in ways that I think are unimaginable. My third point is related to that, in that globalization has always been key to German conceptions of its own power, in that globalization has been a huge motor and enabler of German prosperity and thereby of German power. That means we have a first-order strategic interest in protecting globalization and a liberal international order. I'd be the first to say we haven't done as much as we ought to have in protecting that international order, but there is certainly a great deal of thinking going on in my country about how to contribute more to this. And finally, my fourth point is that NATO and EU enlargement have also been huge, significant enablers of German security. The irony here, of course, is that NATO and EU enlargement surrounded us not just with democratizing, increasingly more prosperous trading partners, but they also made us more secure because they helped us push our security problems to the periphery of Europe. Remember that when I was a child and an adolescent going to university, Germany was a frontline state in the Cold War. We grew up with the notion that if there ever was a war, the German armed forces, the West German armed forces, would spend 3 weeks in conventional warfare protecting the inner German border of 1,700 kilometers. And after that, we would have nuclear war and we would be a pile of ashes. That made for a certain, it's actually, I'm saying this not to joke, that this, I think, had a significant impact on the German psyche, this situation. And the switch in '89 from that feeling of the sort of nuclear annihilation always hanging over you to being able to outsource your security problems to Europe's periphery was truly significant. And for a while, I think, meant that we checked out of realizing just how much was happening on the periphery. That now has completely changed. And with that, let me give you a brief overview of the shifts that have happened in Germany's strategic assessment of its own strategic situation. There are, of course, all the external shifts which we have mentioned here. Russian revisionism, which even if you think we might have reacted to that somewhat less than alertly, for many Germans started with Georgia. It certainly became a lot more, shall we say, intensely felt in Berlin with the annexation of Crimea and Russian ongoing meddling in Ukraine, and then increasingly so and increasingly urgently with Russian meddling in the European project proper through a broad variety of hybrid warfare, from propaganda to bribes, financing extremist political parties and the like. And of course, the other great external factor is the increasing Middle Eastern instability, which has maximized refugee and migrant outflows to Europe, and where, of course, as we know, there is also a Russian contribution in the regulation of this instability. Another important external factor was the financial and the Eurozone crisis, which also put Germany on a front row role in managing the crisis. Then Brexit, the American elections, which, as Heather has already described, may or may not significantly change the strategic environment in which we operate in. And then looking forward, we have elections in Europe, in the Netherlands, in France, perhaps in Italy, and of course in my own country on September 24th. And not least, we have authoritarian and populist surges, as I said, all across the European Union, including in my own country. All of that has had an enormous impact on the way Germany conceptualizes its own strategic situation and its relationship with its neighbors in the EU and in NATO. We're all familiar with the term the reluctant hegemon. Partly this has happened by default because of the UK's preoccupation with Brexit and by France's preoccupation with its domestic politics and its economic situation. And they're both countries which, for us, we were used to looking towards and gearing our behavior by, becoming a lot more inward-looking and leaving us more exposed. In addition to that, we are in the middle of and straddling the consensus divides in Europe on the three main issues of the day: the Russian sanctions and more generally the question of how to react to Russian revisionism and aggression, Eurozone management, which is still an ongoing issue as we can see from the current situation with Greece, and the refugee crisis management. Now, I would be, again, the first to say that you can make valid criticisms of Germany's actions on all three fronts, although I would suggest that we've been rather more successful than even I would have expected on managing the Russian sanctions. I think there, in general, I would give the Germans rather better marks than anybody would have expected. Eurozone management, not so much. Refugee crisis management, I personally would say the humanitarian principle was admirable. If we hadn't opened German doors, there would have been a massive crisis in the neighboring countries who, in most ways, were far more vulnerable than we were. We are simply the stronger country. We have the greater resources. It was the responsible thing to do. What surprised me as a German was the fact that, well, if you'd asked me how this would then work, I would say, well, German authorities will manage very capably. German civil society was upset. Well, guess what? It was the other way around. German authorities were completely overwhelmed, and German civil society, with a sigh, sort of rolled up its arms and stepped in truly startling ways. One of my friend's 82-year-old retired gynecologist mother put herself back into the workforce because, as she said, they're going to need gynecologists, aren't they? A friend of mine who works in a Berlin ministry, a 24/7 job, nevertheless found time to volunteer in a refugee home, etc., etc. Many of my friends were doing these things and are still doing them. Something that I think came as a significant surprise to many of us who thought that Germans weren't quite as good at volunteering as, say, the Americans are. Now, I think my final point here, you cannot overstate the importance of the attempts that have been made in the last 3 years in Berlin to live up to the new responsibilities produced by this situation. You can say we're still falling short of the 2% goal. We're still falling short we're failing to build consensus of this or that issue, and I would be the first to agree with you. But at the same time, things have happened in the German political space which would have been unimaginable 5, 3, or 2 years ago, and which are now happening. And this increase, this gearing up to live up to these responsibilities is not something that is casual or that is uncoordinated. It is highly deliberate. It is highly planned. You've seen review processes in the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry. You've seen a white book in the first one in 10 years that is very interesting to read indeed. You're seeing increases in the defense budget that, again, by German standards would have been political suicide a couple years ago and are now simply happening. You're seeing a reform in defense procurement. You're seeing Germans reaching out to smaller neighboring nations in the context of the Framework Nations concept to improve defense cooperation, including with Norway. And I would say to you, the Framework Nations concept has two important elements, two which are quite revolutionary. One is that what this means is that we're trying to provide the backbone for cases where the Americans aren't there, for whatever reason, which could be completely legitimate, i.e. that the Americans or American public or American Congress wants us to do something on our own, and they simply don't want to contribute, which I think would be perfectly legitimate, and we should have been planning for a long time ago. Or they are preoccupied in a crisis elsewhere and or need their assets there and can't lend them to us. That's what we're trying to prepare for. Obviously, Germany will never be in a position to provide the entire backbone in the way that the Americans have done in a time of major crisis or all-out war. What we are talking about here is something much more realistic, something between a minor and a medium-sized engagement. But what it also means, and that second point is even more important, is that a nation that provides the backbone no longer really has the option, de facto, of saying no. that strikes me as a rather significant infringement on the parliamentary veto, which, as you know, is a holy taboo in my country's political culture. So I would argue to you that these are all really significant shifts in Germany's postures, and regardless of they will obviously be tested within a crisis and in practice, but regardless of that, they're huge in their symbolic importance and as political signaling. Now, there are limitations on all of this, of course. It would be a mistake to think that Germany can, as it were, be the non-reluctant hegemon of Europe and run Europe, or even play the role within Europe that Americans for so long, and I hope in future will as well, play in NATO. Europe just doesn't work that way. The EU doesn't work that way. And if we, Germany, don't become better at building consensus, at making sacrifices, at sacrificing our own direct, limited national interest for larger European interests on some issues, such as, say, European growth and stability initiatives, then we will have, I think, limited success with what we're doing now. I don't see us succeeding in this without US support and engagement. And as you know, Angela Merkel is running for the fourth time in September. Her position is contested at home. And there are a number of reasons to feel a little queasy about the current German domestic political context, and not least because the Russians are trying to help and make it confusing and contentious. What I can say to you is that regardless of where Germany goes, I think the one thing that will never happen again is a German Sonderweg, Germany taking off on its own on a trajectory of make Germany great again. I think that that's a lesson we've learned forever, but which is also means that without the EU and without NATO, we will be in dire straits. Conversely, that means that protecting the EU and protecting NATO is a first-order strategic interest for us. And if we find ourselves at odds, both with Russia and with an American administration about these two issues, then we are going to be in a very difficult situation indeed. Thank you.
So Germany finds itself in a very difficult strategic position indeed.